In 1275, a 21-year-old Venetian named Marco Polo arrived at the summer palace of Kublai Khan in the Mongol capital of Chengdu, in what is now Inner Mongolia. He had been traveling for almost 4 years to get there. Over the next 2 decades, he would serve in the Khan's administration, travel the length of the Yuan Empire, and accumulate the observations that became, after his return to Venice and his subsequent imprisonment by the Genoese, the most famous travel account of the Middle Ages. And in the chapters of that account where Marco Polo describes what he saw in China, he keeps returning to a single observation that he cannot quite get the European reader to believe. The Chinese were using paper as money, not paper that promised gold, not paper backed by anything you could touch, just paper, sheets of mulberry bark paper stamped with the imperial seal, circulating across an empire of 100 million people, as if the paper itself were silver. Marco Polo describes the manufacturing process in detail. He describes the punishment for forgery, death. He describes how the emperor used the paper to pay his armies, his administrators, his suppliers. He describes the apparent stability of the system, the universal acceptance of the notes across thousands of miles of imperial territory. Then he writes a single sentence that sums up his disbelief. He notes that the Khan, by issuing this paper, has made himself richer than any treasury that ever existed, because the paper costs almost nothing to produce, and the goods it buys are real. Marco Polo had stumbled onto what is, in retrospect, one of the most consequential inventions in the history of human civilization: the paper banknote, currency that has no intrinsic value, that depends entirely on the political authority of the issuer, that can be created at almost zero marginal cost, had been operating in China for nearly 300 years before he arrived. It would take Europe another 400 years to adopt it. When Europe finally did, every modern paper currency on Earth would trace its lineage back to those mulberry bark notes the Khan was issuing. And the central feature of paper money, the feature that Marco Polo flagged in 1275, and that has been demonstrated in every paper currency experiment since, is that the system rests on a fiction. The fiction is that the paper is worth what it says it is worth. The fiction holds, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries, and then, eventually, it breaks. This is the story of how that fiction was engineered, how it spread, and how every modern currency in your wallet is a direct descendant of a Chinese tax evasion strategy from the year 1024. To find the actual origin of paper money, earlier than Marco Polo, earlier than Kublai Khan, you have to go back to the Song dynasty in the city of Chengdu, in what is now Sichuan province, around the year 1000. The Song dynasty had a problem. Sichuan, at the western edge of the empire, had run out of copper. Chinese coinage at the time was made of copper alloy. Sichuan's local mints had switched, decades earlier, to iron, a vastly heavier and less valuable metal. The economic consequence was absurd. A merchant traveling to buy goods at a regional market needed to bring iron coins so heavy that a small purchase required a wagon. The historian Richard von Glahn at UCLA, in his work on the monetary history of imperial China, recorded that a string of 1,000 iron coins in 11th century Sichuan weighed approximately 25 pounds. The amount needed to buy a roll of silk weighed approximately 130 pounds. Merchants in Chengdu started doing what merchants in any era figure out how to do when physical currency becomes unworkable. They deposited the coins with trusted local houses and accepted, in exchange, paper receipts. The receipts circulated. A merchant in Chengdu could pay a supplier in another city with a receipt rather than a wagon of iron. The supplier could redeem the receipt at the original deposit house, or could pass it on to someone else who would. The paper was easier to move. The paper was easier to count. The paper was easier to hide. By 1023, 16 of these private receipt-issuing houses had grown to dominate the Sichuan economy. They had also begun, predictably, to fail. Some of them were over-issuing receipts beyond the coin reserves they actually held. Others were collapsing under fraud. Provincial government, faced with the imminent destruction of the regional payment system, did something that had never been done by any state in human history. In 1024, the Song imperial government nationalized the private receipt-issuing houses, established a state monopoly on the issuance of paper notes, and began printing currency directly. The notes were called jiaozi. They were issued in fixed denominations, printed in multicolour woodblock, sealed with imperial stamps designed to defeat forgery, and circulated as legal tender throughout Sichuan. That year, 1024, is the date paper money becomes a state instrument. Every modern currency in the world descends from this decision. The Federal Reserve note in your wallet is the lineal descendant of a Sichuan iron coin substitute issued by a Song Imperial Commission 999 years before you were born. The system worked for a while. By the 11th century, the Song dynasty had extended the jiaozi into a national currency, used across the entire empire. By the time the Mongols conquered the Song in 1279 and replaced them with the Yuan dynasty, paper money had been in continuous state-issued circulation in China for over 2.5 centuries. Kublai Khan, who Marco Polo would meet 4 years before this conquest completed, inherited a fully functioning paper currency system and extended it. Under the Yuan, paper money became the only legal tender across the empire. Gold and silver coins were banned from circulation. The state collected the precious metals into the imperial treasury and forced the population to use paper exclusively. And this is where, for the first time in recorded history, the central temptation of paper money asserted itself. Because if the paper costs almost nothing to produce, and the paper buys real goods, then the temptation to produce more paper is irresistible. The Yuan emperors began doing exactly that. They printed jiaozi faster than the underlying economy was growing. By the 1350s, the value of the Yuan currency had collapsed. A note that had bought a measure of grain in 1300 bought a tenth of a measure in 1350. The empire's tax revenues, denominated in the same depreciating paper, evaporated. The Yuan dynasty, already weakened by famine and rebellion, was overthrown in 1368. The pattern is worth noting. It will repeat. It will repeat with such consistency across so many centuries and so many continents that you can almost set a watch by it. Phase 1. A state introduces a paper currency, backed by a credible promise that the paper can be exchanged for metal. Phase 2. The state honors the promise for a generation or two. Confidence builds. The paper circulates at face value. The economy expands using the new instrument. Phase 3. The state, facing a fiscal crisis, issues more paper than it can back. Sometimes the crisis is a war. Sometimes it is a famine. Sometimes it is simple political weakness. The reason barely matters. Phase 4. The promise of redemption is suspended, sometimes officially, more often quietly. The paper continues to circulate, but at a deepening discount to its face value. Phase 5. The currency collapses. The state defaults. A new currency replaces the old one, sometimes the same dynasty, sometimes a successor regime. Or the country is conquered. Then Phase 6, which is the part that surprises people. The new state, looking at the ruin of the old paper currency, decides that the solution is to issue a new paper currency with a credible promise of redemption. And the cycle restarts. China ran through several iterations of this cycle between 1024 and the Ming dynasty's eventual abandonment of paper money in the mid-1400s. After the Ming gave up, China would not have a meaningful paper currency again until the late 19th century. The European powers that arrived at Chinese ports in the 1500s and 1600s found a country that had run the world's longest paper money experiment and quietly concluded that the experiment was not worth repeating. Europe came to the same conclusion by a different route. The Europeans did not learn the lesson from China. They learned it from their own first attempt, which ended exactly the way the Chinese cycle predicted, and which permanently scarred European monetary thinking for the entire 18th century. The attempt happened in France between 1716 and 1720, and it was the work of a single Scotsman who was, simultaneously, a brilliant economist and a wanted murderer. John Law had killed a man in a duel in London in 1694. He had been convicted, sentenced to hang, escaped from prison, and fled to the continent. Over the next 20 years, he wandered between Paris, Amsterdam, Genoa, and Venice, working as a professional gambler and developing the economic theories that would eventually make him, briefly, the most powerful man in France. Law's theory was that the wealth of a nation was constrained by the available supply of money, and that the supply of money was unnecessarily restricted by the requirement that every coin be backed by physical metal. If a country could issue paper currency in sufficient quantity to fully employ its productive capacity, Law argued, the country would grow richer in real terms. More goods produced, more trade conducted, more taxes collected. The metal that backed the paper was, in Law's view, a constraint with no economic justification. In 1716, after years of lobbying, Law convinced the French regent, Philippe d'Orléans, to authorize an experiment. France, recovering from the catastrophic debts of Louis XIV's wars, was in fiscal crisis. The French treasury was effectively bankrupt. Law was given a license to establish a private bank, the Banque Générale, with the authority to issue paper notes redeemable in silver. The financial historian Antoine Murphy, who taught at Trinity College Dublin and produced the standard modern biography of Law in 1997, has documented in granular detail what happened next. Murphy's account is essential because the Law episode was so heavily mythologized by hostile contemporaries that the actual economic mechanics were obscured for 2 full centuries. What Law was doing was, in modern terms, sophisticated. He was running an early central bank, conducting open market operations, managing a sovereign debt restructuring, and operating a national investment vehicle, all simultaneously. He was, in 1719, doing things that the Bank of England would not learn how to do until the late 1800s. The problem was not that Law was incompetent. The problem was that the political class around him understood almost nothing of what he was actually doing. And when the system began to wobble, neither did he. The bank was a success. The notes were trusted. The economy responded. Within 2 years, the bank had been nationalized and renamed the Banque Royale, and Law had been given authority to issue notes against the assets of the Mississippi Company, a French trading firm Law had organized to develop the Louisiana territories. And here, the system began to inflate. Law issued more and more banknotes. He used the notes to fund the Mississippi Company's stock issuance. The stock issuance drove the share price up. The rising share price drove demand for more notes. The notes were used to buy more stock. The stock was used to support more notes. By the end of 1719, the share price of the Mississippi Company had increased by a factor of nearly 40. Paris was full of newly wealthy speculators. The word millionaire enters the English language in this period, coined to describe the French who had grown rich on Law's paper. In January of 1720, John Law was appointed Controller General of Finances of France. He was, in effect, the Chancellor of the French Exchequer. He was also a foreigner, a Protestant in Catholic France, and a convicted murderer. None of this had been forgotten. The French aristocracy, which had watched commoners become wealthier than dukes inside of 12 months, was furious. In February of 1720, a small number of Parisian investors began to redeem their banknotes for silver. The bank had enough silver on hand to meet the first redemptions. Word spread. More redemptions followed. Within weeks, the bank was facing a full classical bank run. Law tried everything. He outlawed the private holding of gold and silver. He forced the population to deposit precious metals with the bank. He decreed the banknotes to be the only legal tender. He decreed that the notes would lose half their face value over time to force people to spend them rather than redeem them. The decrees made the panic worse. By December of 1720, the Mississippi Company's share price had collapsed by 95%. The banknotes were worth almost nothing. John Law fled France disguised in women's clothing. He died 9 years later in Venice, in poverty, having spent his last years writing apologias for a system that had ruined a generation of French savers. The Mississippi Bubble, as it became known, was the largest financial collapse in French history before the Revolution. The economic historian Antoine Murphy, who wrote the standard modern biography of Law, calculated that the wealth destroyed in the collapse approximately equaled 3 years of the entire French national output. France would not attempt a paper currency again for the better part of a century. When the revolutionary government finally did, with the assignats of the 1790s, the result was the same: runaway inflation, currency collapse, political crisis. The pattern from Sichuan in 1024 had replayed itself in Paris in 1720, scene for scene. And the British, watching this from across the Channel, drew the conclusion that would define the next 2 centuries of Western monetary policy. Paper money could be issued safely, the British concluded, only if it was rigidly redeemable for a fixed quantity of gold. The amount of paper in circulation had to be tied, by inviolable law, to the gold sitting in the issuing bank's vault. Any deviation from this principle would end exactly the way the Mississippi bubble had ended. This is the gold standard. It is the system every major world currency was built on between roughly 1816 and 1971. And it is a system whose entire intellectual foundation was a reaction to a Scottish murderer's failed experiment in 1720. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover deep histories of everyday money like this every week. The British formally adopted the gold standard in 1816, under the Coinage Act of that year. The pound sterling was legally fixed at 113 grains of fine gold. Bank of England notes were redeemable on demand for the precise quantity of gold their face value specified. The system held, with brief interruptions during wars, for the entire 19th century. By 1900, almost every major economy in the world had joined it. The international gold standard, by the early 20th century, governed the monetary relationships between Britain, France, Germany, the United States, Russia, Japan, and dozens of smaller nations. Then came the First World War, and the gold standard did what every paper currency system in history had done when subjected to serious fiscal pressure. It cracked. Britain suspended gold convertibility in 1914 to fund the war effort. So did France. So did Germany. The United States, which entered the war later, maintained convertibility longer, but also strained the system. After the war, the European powers attempted to return to gold at their pre-war parities. The attempt was a catastrophe. Britain returned to gold in 1925 at the pre-war rate, which was now wildly overvalued given the inflation the war had produced. The result was a decade of British economic stagnation. France returned at a deliberately undervalued rate, which caused German economic distress. The system limped through the 1920s and broke entirely in the early 1930s. Britain abandoned gold in 1931. The United States followed in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102 and made it illegal for American citizens to own gold bullion or coins. The federal government confiscated, in 1933, prices approximately $500 million in private gold from American citizens, at the official rate of $20.67 per ounce. 6 months later, the government revalued gold at $35 per ounce. The citizens whose gold had been seized had been compensated at the old rate. They lost 40% of their wealth overnight, in a transfer engineered by a single presidential order. The system that emerged after World War II, the Bretton Woods system, negotiated at a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, was a modified gold standard, in which only the United States dollar was redeemable for gold, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. The world, in effect, had agreed to trust American gold reserves on behalf of everyone. That system held for 27 years. On the 15th of August 1971, President Richard Nixon, facing a run on American gold reserves caused by foreign governments redeeming dollars at the official rate, issued an executive announcement that ended gold convertibility entirely. The decision was made over a single weekend at Camp David, in consultation with a small group of advisors that included Treasury Secretary John Connolly and Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns. The announcement was made on a Sunday evening, during a televised address that preempted the popular Western series Bonanza. Nixon presented the move as a temporary measure to defend the dollar from speculative attack. It was not temporary. It has not been reversed in the 54 years since. The American dollar, and every currency in the world pegged to it, has operated since that August 1971 evening as a pure fiat currency, paper, or digital entries representing paper, backed by nothing but the political authority of the issuing state. This is the system you live under now. Every dollar in your wallet, Every euro, every pound, every yen, every yuan, none of them is redeemable for any specific quantity of any physical commodity. They are worth what the issuing government says they are worth, and what the market is willing to accept them for. The promise that historically backed paper money, the promise that you could, in theory, walk into the issuing bank and trade the paper for metal, was permanently withdrawn in 1971 and has not been restored. Which brings us back to Marco Polo's original observation, slightly updated. The Khan, by issuing this paper, has made himself richer than any treasury that ever existed, because the paper costs almost nothing to produce, and the goods it buys are real. The modern central bank has, in the last 54 years, demonstrated something the Yuan emperors discovered the hard way in the 1300s. If the paper is no longer redeemable, the only thing constraining the amount of paper the state can issue is political restraint. The state can, in theory, issue as much as it wants. The state has, in practice, been doing exactly that. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet has expanded from approximately $870 billion in 2007 to over $7 trillion in 2024. The European Central Bank's balance sheet has gone through a similar expansion. The Bank of Japan's balance sheet now exceeds the entire annual economic output of Japan. Every period in history during which paper money was issued in this kind of quantity without metallic backing has ended the same way. The historian Peter Bernholtz, in his comprehensive study of currency collapses across recorded history, identified roughly 30 separate cases of high or hyperinflation in the 20th century alone. The driving cause in essentially every case was the same. The state issued more paper than its productive economy could absorb. The Weimar Republic in 1923 stands as the canonical modern example. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January of 1923 cost 400 billion marks by November of the same year. Workers were paid twice a day, so they could spend the morning wages before the afternoon paper had depreciated below subsistence. Photographs from the period show citizens pushing wheelbarrows of cash to buy groceries. The system did not collapse because Weimar Germany was uniquely corrupt or uniquely incompetent. It collapsed because the German state, facing impossible reparations and a fiscal deficit it could not finance through taxation, did the same thing the Yuan dynasty did in the 1350s and the French monarchy did in 1720. It printed. Hungary in 1946 produced the worst hyperinflation in recorded human history. Prices doubled approximately every 15 hours at the peak. The pengo, the national currency, had to be replaced with a new currency, the forint, at an exchange rate of 400 octillion to 1, that is, the number 4 followed by 29 zeros. Zimbabwe in 2008, Venezuela in 2018, Argentina repeatedly across the entire 20th century. The pattern in every case fits the cycle Marco Polo would have recognized from his time at the Khan's court. The fiction that paper is worth what it says it is worth has held, on average across history, for somewhere between 30 and 300 years per currency. Some last longer, some break sooner. The dollar in your wallet, in its post-1971 form, is 54 years into its run. Marco Polo wrote down what he saw in 1275. He could not get the European reader to believe him. The European reader, 800 years later, lives entirely inside the system Marco Polo was describing, and finds it as unremarkable as breathing. The paper has been circulating long enough that nobody thinks about what the paper actually is. The paper, as the Khan understood, is the cheapest substance the issuing authority can produce. The goods it buys are real. The difference between the cost of the paper and the value of the goods is the seigniorage, the profit the state earns simply by being permitted to print. Every functioning paper currency in human history has run on this principle. Every collapsed paper currency in human history has run on this principle. The only variable is how long the political authority can sustain the fiction before the population stops believing it. That is the 800-year lie. It is by far the most successful lie ever told in the history of human economic life. It funds armies. It funds infrastructure. It funds welfare states and corporate bailouts and pension systems. It funds the screen you are watching this on. It is also, every time it has ever been tried, a finite arrangement. There has not yet been a paper currency in human history that lasted forever. The current paper currencies are not the exception. They are the most recent instance of a pattern that has played out with structural consistency since a Song dynasty official in Chengdu signed the first state-issued jiaozi in 1024. The Khan understood, in 1275, what we have spent 800 years occasionally forgetting and rediscovering. The paper is a promise. The promise can be broken, and the people holding the paper, when the promise breaks, are always the last to find out. If this changed how you think about the bills in your wallet, the video on screen right now goes deeper into another piece of financial history hiding in plain sight.